Okay, so what did we discuss last week? We discussed, where are we up to? We're up to the story where Laban steals, and Jacob speaks to his wives, and they decide that they want to leave. And the reason why Jacob wants to leave is because he tells his wives that I see that your father and your brothers, their countenance is not the way it was in the past. In other words, they're not happy with me anymore. They're starting to get upset and starting to get jealous. He took that either then the verse says, and God spoke to me. There's two interpretations we mentioned last week. One is, and he had a revelation that it's time to go back home. Another interpretation is, if the circumstances are not working out, that's God's way of telling you it's time to pick up. So in other words, does he see the prophecy, or does he understand the circumstances to be God talking to him through the circumstances, which is actually very interesting interpretation, in my opinion. Then they run away, they leave. And they leave, and then on top of page 165, Genesis chapter 31, we read about Laban hears about this, and he chases Jacob, and they catch up, and he catches up to them on the seventh day they meet, and we have a description in verse 24 how God tells Laban at night in the dream. He says, verse 24, he says, so God had come to Laban the Aramean in a dream by night and said to him, beware lest you speak with Jacob either good or bad. That expression of the Talmud has this expression. You tell the bee, don't give me your honey and don't give me your sting. Right? If you don't like somebody, don't speak to him, period. So that's what God tells them. The problem. Sorry.
Why does the Talmud say that? I don't understand.
It says a metaphor. It says hamashal. It's a metaphor that you tell a bee. Sometimes you tell somebody that you don't trust, for example, and the guy comes saying, "I want to be your friend. I want to help you." Sometimes it's not saying you should say this every time. I got it. So the Talmud is not saying you should say this. He's saying that's what people say. Sometimes you tell somebody. In Yiddish, there's a phrase that is here. Don't do me any favors, right? So here, God says, don't speak to him mitoy, from good to bad. Don't speak to him at all. So that's the conventional interpretation of this verse 24. The problem with verse 24 is that Laban, not only does he speak to him, but he gives him a whole speech. Starts 25, and it goes on and on and on. You have 2 pages here, the entire page 165, most of page 165, the entire page 167, and some of 169. So God just comes and tells him, don't speak to him from good to bad, and he keeps talking. So how do you understand? Is he defying God's words? He doesn't want to defy God's words. Later he tells Jacob, I would have harmed you if not for God speaking to me and telling me not to. So that's not a major question, but it's an interesting question. The answer is very cute. I'm just going to hit record because I think I forgot to do that, unless I'm mistaken. No, it's recording. What is the answer? So I read the answer in that Barbanel. Barbanel says like this. What does God tell him? Don't speak to him. Literally, how do they translate it here? Let's see how they translate it. Verse 24. Beware lest you speak with Jacob, either good or bad. That's not the literal translation. What's the literal translation? Mitoy v'adra. What's me? From. Don't speak to him from good until bad. Literally, don't speak at all. Don't speak good or bad. From good to bad. So that Barbanel is very creative. He says, from good to bad. Don't start speaking good and end up bad. If you have a problem with somebody and you have a disagreement, start with bad. Say what you disagree. And then you'll make peace, right? Let's say I have a grudge against somebody. There's 2 ways to do it. One is like I give you a compliment just that you should listen to me, but then I end off with a negative. Say, no, that's not it. You want to speak to Jacob? Don't speak to him from good to bad. You want to speak to him from bad to good? No problem. Nothing wrong with sharing your pain and sharing your grief and sharing your perspective, which is exactly what Laban does. So I think that's a little bit cute to see that in the words, a literal translation from good to bad. Don't go from good to bad, from bad to good you could do. And that's exactly what Laban does.
Yeah, may I ask you? a
Yes.
question, Rabbi? Yep. In this whole narrative, there's only one Laban. So why does the Torah make the distinction, Laban the Aramaic?
So I don't know the answer. It's possible that it's highlighting, at least perhaps the thesis we're going to present is that we're highlighting at this point. Okay, let me just give you the spoiler. Let me say where we're going, and then we'll try to answer your question. I was going to try to save it a little bit later to hold the suspense, but you're asking the right questions, so you exposing my thesis here, not my thesis, but a thesis. What's happening here is they get into a fight, they make peace, and they leave and they make peace, and they make a symbol, two symbols, they're making peace. It seems like they're making peace, but many people read that a careful reading of these verses will tell you that they're making peace, but they're actually separating. Jacob is basically going back home and saying, we alluded to it last week and the week before, but here you'll see it even stronger. I'm not part of your clan. I'm my own clan. I'm going home. Have a nice day. We're peaceful, but I'm not part of you. If that's the theory, I understand why he says Aramean, because he wants to highlight this Laban the Aramean versus Jacob doesn't say Jacob the Hebrew, but Jacob the Hebrew. He's going back. He's not from Aram. So when you call one person the Aramean, and you're keeping Jacob out of that, you're highlighting the differences between the two.
But let me push back on that.
Yeah.
But in the Seder and the Haggadah, it says that Jacob's a wandering Aramean.
No, you say Arami Oived Avi. If I'm not mistaken, if we're referring to the same thing, it says the Aramean tried to destroy our ancestor.
I believe it also says my father, the wandering Aramean.
It could be. So I can't tell you what I can't.
We'll leave that to
Can't remember what happened yesterday. Certainly can't remember what happened a few months ago. But so it's possible that there are. Look, we come from Aram. In fact, it's actually funny. The reason why we're called Hebrews is because when we came to, according to the Medrash, when we came to Canaan, we were from the other side of the river. We were from Aram. So that's the challenge here. On one hand, our origin is from Aram, but at some point, God says, Lech lecha, go to yourself, separate. Now, what some of the commentaries point out, separation is not going to happen until this week's parsha, because Jacob keeps still go. Abraham sends his servant back to get a wife for Isaac, and Isaac and Jacob runs back to get a wife. So you're not really leaving if you keep it going back. At this point, they make a separation. They make a separation. They make a separation. Now, Mark tells me that what you're referring to is referring to Abraham. So Abraham is referred to Aramean. Neil says, no, we'll have to bring the books next week and settle the dispute.
We'll wait till past.
Either way, Mark says it's an alternate translation. So that may not be precise in the Hebrew. Very good. But in either case, we're not denying our history. We are from Aram. Right, we are from there. There's no question about that. The question is, how do we define ourselves? Are we still from there, or are we separate? Are we creating our own legacy, our own starting our own a dynasty or lineage? There's a funny story. I forget the story. I'm always bad at stories, but at some point there was somebody in the yeshiva who had a great lineage, and he was a little bit arrogant because somebody else was a great scholar, but he had no prominent lineage. And in that world, the lineage was a big deal. So the guy says, oh yeah, but you're a great guy, but you don't have a lineage. He says, yes, the difference between me and you is your prominent lineage ends with you. For me, I'm starting a new one, right? So it's not about where you're from. It's about, we're starting our own lineage in some way, separating from the ways and the idolatry of Aram. So that is perhaps why the Torah here emphasizes Laban ha'arami, Laban the Aramean. Yes.
Don't the sages teach us that no Jew's yichus is better than anybody else's?
Right, but as a people, we're different. Oh, you're saying about the yeshiva? Yes, of course. The guy shouldn't have done what he did. Yes, of course. But not everybody, even the people who go to yeshiva, not everybody
adheres.
Not everybody adheres. There's a funny story that there's a Hasidic singer named Avram Fried, and he says a story way back when they ever started encouraging people to put on tefillin with strangers or Jews. So some of the very religious people weren't happy. And they said, oh, how could you talk to people who are not religious? You can't do it. Sort of super ultra orthodox. So Avram Fried says a story. He says, once I'm sitting I'm sitting in the street and I asked someone to put on tefillin, and a very, very ultra Hasidic guy comes up to me and says, how could you put on tefillin with somebody who's not religious? So Avram Fried says, you don't know who this guy is? He says, he is a direct descendant from the Baal Shem Tov. He says, what? The direct descendant from the Baal Shem Tov? You're doing such a mitzvah, you're helping him put on tefillin, it's amazing, you're saving the world. Fine. He puts on tefillin, Avram Fried says, oh, I made a little mistake. He's not really a direct descendant of the Baal Shem Tov, but he is a direct descendant of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Right? That's our lineage. We're all yeah, go ahead.
God comes to him in a dream, and he separates it, in my view,
Yes.
from as an Aramean, because God knows the kind of behavior, which maybe wasn't perfect, and he separates him.
Yeah.
Out, and he gives the message to
Jacob.
Laban,
Yeah.
don't mess around. I know what you are.
Right.
And you can't hurt him, and I'm trying to help you at the same time, but I know who you are. That's why he separates.
Right. In
Sort of
some
what you
ways.
said, he separates Jacob as a good,
Right.
and this is the way of that's my, I
God's
look at
way.
things in a different,
That makes sense.
in a different way.
Okay. What I want to do now is I want to read very quickly of just a few samples of Jacob's claim about what Laban claims against Jacob, how Jacob responds, and the peace treaty. I really want to think about the peace treaty because that's where we want to show that there's more to the surface here. So there's a lot of text here. So I'm going to try to do this very quickly. I'm not going to read everything. But maybe we'll take 3-4 minutes just to read text. So I'm starting on page 165, and verse 24 is where God tells Laban at night, don't speak to Jacob from good to bad. And then now let's read 25. We'll read a few verses. 25. Laban overtook Jacob. Jacob had pitched his tent on the mountain, while Laban had stationed his kinsmen on Mount Gilad. So I guess somehow there's a mountain and they're each on one side of the mountain. And that was that night. And in the morning they meet up. What happened? Verse 26, Laban said to Jacob, what have you done that you have this? What have you done that you have deceived me and led my daughters away like captives of the sword? You take my daughters and run. Now that's not actually true because we know he asked his wives. He asked Leah and Rachel last week, but Laban may not know that, or he's not honest. Why have you fled so steadily and cheated me? Nor did you tell me, for I would have sent you with gladness, with songs, and with timbrel, and with lyre. I'd make a whole festival to send you off. And you did not even allow me to kiss my sons and daughters. Now you have acted foolishly. It is in my power to do you all harm. But the God of your father addressed me last night, saying, beware of speaking with Jacob, either good or bad. Now you have left because you longed greatly for your father's house. Why did you steal my gods? That's his claim. You ran away. You took my daughters away like captives of war. You didn't let me kiss my grandchildren. You stole my gods.
He did exactly what God didn't want him to do.
Okay, that could be. So that's his conventional interpretation. And in other words, one interpretation is he's doing what God didn't want him to do. But the kinder way of reading it is eventually he starts with bad and goes to good.
Okay.
Because at the end he makes peace. So Abarbanel is saying, well, maybe he is consistent with God in the sense if you take the words of God in the Hebrew literally and you say don't speak from good to bad. So you're speaking bad, then good. So that's sort of where we're reading Laban much kinder than just someone who's defying God. Because basically, when you read it before that Abarbanel, he's not listening. He's listening to God in the sense that he's not harming Jacob, but he's not listening to God in the sense that he is speaking to him bad. Or you could say this is not bad. He's just saying his claim. Okay. What does Jacob say? The first thing Jacob says is, "I was afraid you wouldn't let me let your daughters come with me. You steal me your daughter." Let's read a few verses. Okay, I'm sorry, there's a lot of reading today. Says Jacob, verse 31. Jacob answered and said to Laban, because I was afraid, for I thought perhaps you might steal your daughters from me. With whomever you find your gods, he shall not live. In the presence of our kinsmen, ascertain yourself what is with me and take it back. Now Jacob did not know that Rachel had stolen them. So basically, why did I run away? Because I was afraid you wouldn't let your daughters go. You would steal your daughters from me. I stole something. I didn't steal anything. And then the Torah describes how Laban searches the entire, all the tents of all the wives, and he searches everywhere and doesn't find it. And basically, in verse 36, Jacob is enraged. Verse 36, page 167, Jacob became angered, and he took up his grievance with Laban. Jacob spoke up and said to Laban, Jacob is angered. Why is he angered? Vayichar. Vayichar means his wrath flared. He's very angry. Why is he so angry? He just told his father-in-law, look for the gods. He didn't find the gods. Everything is fine. Why are you getting so upset? So one commentary says like this: the gods, whatever they are, they're large, size of a person. Laban is looking everywhere, touching everything. So now, what Laban realizes, what Jacob Laban thinks, is that the whole idea that the gods were stolen is a libel. That's what he thinks. He's not. The reality is that Rachel took it. He says he just made that libel so he could search all my stuff. How do I know that? Because look what it says later. It says in that same verse, in verse 37. So let's read 36 and 37. Jacob became angered and he took up his grievance with Laban. Jacob spoke up and said to Laban, what is my transgression? What is my sin that you have hotly pursued me? When you rummaged through all my things, you touched all my things. So the commentaries say that's why Jacob is so angry. Now he suspects that that Laban is just coming to see what's going on. That doesn't really care about the gods. In any case, and here he basically says how loyal he was to him. And I'm sorry?
It didn't work.
What didn't work?
Because he ended up with Laban said something good at the end.
Yeah.
But Jacob took the bad words and
Yeah.
felt really bad.
Right.
He never, and it said either good or bad.
Right. Well, that's a translation.
Well, okay.
Either is
But
translation.
I'm an American.
No, it could be
I
that's
can-
a translation. That's a translation.
Well,
Yeah.
that's what it says. And so it backfired
Right.
because he felt so bad about being told that from Laban.
Yeah. So there's no question. This is 20
He
years.
didn't remember the good stuff.
This is 20 years of tension coming out. And you'll see what he says. He basically says, the last 20 years, I was loyal to you, and this is what you did to me. So it's not just they're getting a fight about somebody said something now. This is 20 years. This tension is 20 years in the making, right? So verse 38, these 20 years I have been with you, your ewes and she-goats never miscarried, nor did I eat rams of your flock. That which was mangled, I never bought you. I myself would bear the loss. From me, you would exact it, whether it was stolen by day or stolen by night. This is how I was. By day, scorching heat consumed me, and the frost by night, my sleep drifted from my eyes. This is my 20 years in your household. I served you 14 years for your 2 daughters and 6 years for your flocks, and you changed my wage 100 times. Had not the God of my father, the God of Abraham and dread of Isaac, been with me, you would surely have now sent me away empty-handed. God saw my wretchedness and the toil of my hands, so he admonished you last night. Then Laban spoke up and said to Jacob, the daughters are my daughters, the children are my children, and the flocks is my flock, and all that you see is mine. Yet to my daughters, what can I do to them this day? Or to the children whom they have born. So now come, let us make a covenant, I and you, and he shall be a witness between me and you. In other words, it seems like what Laban is saying is, you're afraid of me, you think I'm going to harm you. Your daughters are my children, they're my grandchildren. I would never harm them. So let's make a treaty. Let's make a brit, let's make a covenant. And let's read this. So now we got to the covenant. Let's read the covenant and we'll see what happens. So let's read a little bit. Verse 45. Then Jacob took a stone and raised it as a monument. And Jacob said to his brethren, gather stones. So they took stones and made a mound, and they ate there on the mound. You can't have a covenant without a meal, right? It doesn't work that way. So they make a covenant. Laban called it Yegar Sahaduta, which is basically Aramaic for what Jacob is about to say. Jacob called it Gal-Ed. Gal-Ed, Gilad, is the name of a place east of the Jordan. So Gal is a mound, pile of either a mountain, either a small mountain or a pile of stones, mound. And Aid is, of course, testimony. And Yegar Sahaduta is the same thing. Sahaduta is Aramaic for testimony, and Yegar is a mound. So each named it in their own language. And Laban declared, this mound is a witness between me and you today. Therefore, he called the name Gal-Ed. That's what Laban says. And as for the mitzvah, because he said, may Hashem keep watch between me and you when we are out of each other's sight. if you will ill-treat my daughters, or if you will marry wives in addition to my daughters, though no man may be among us, but see, God is a witness between me and you. Here, Laban is saying, we're making a test. We have this sign of a testimony. God will be the witness if you do something against my daughters, because he's going home. So he's not going to be able to be there. And Laban said to Jacob, here is this mound, and here is the monument which I have cast between me and you. This mound shall be witness, and the monument shall be a witness, that I may not cross over to you past this mound, nor may you cross over to me past this mound and this monument for evil. In other words, let this be a sign as a border. You won't cross this to harm me. I won't cross this to harm you. May the God of Abraham and the God of Nahor, who's the God of Nahor? Who's Nahor? Abraham's brother. So, and the grandfather of the grandfather of Laban. So may the God of Abraham, who's Jacob's grandfather, and may the God of Nahor, who's Laban's grandfather, judge between us, the God of their father. And Jacob swore by the dread of his father Isaac. Then Jacob slaughtered for a feast on the mountain and summoned his kinsmen to break bread, and they broke bread and spent the night on the mountain. That's the end of the story. Okay. Now, for a covenant, this is actually very drawn out, because there were covenants earlier in the Torah. Isaac and Pichol, Abraham and Pichol. You can make a covenant in 2 verses, right? You don't need a covenant. You don't need to make a covenant. Besides the conversation, fine, but even the covenant itself begins in verse 45 and goes all the way to 54. So we have 10 verses for a covenant that you could have got rid of in 1 verse. They made a covenant, they made a sign, and they sat and they ate breakfast, right? So something is happening here. There's a lot of nuance in this covenant, and we want to talk about what that nuance is. Another problem with the covenant is that there's really 2 signs of the covenant, and the question is why both. There's a pile of stones, right? If you look back at 55 and 56. So 56 is a pile of stones. Let's start with 55. Jacob took a stone and raised it up as a monument, a matzeva. So there's a monument. And then in 46, and Jacob said to his brethren, whoever that is, we'll get to that, gather stones. So they took stones and made a mound. Now, why do you need 2 signs of the monument, of a covenant? Either make a pile of stones or make a monument. Why do you need both? It's another problem. The other problem is they keep jumping back and forth. We'll show in a minute how it's not so simple. There's a lot of tension here. Go ahead, Richard, please.
Can you hear me okay?
Are you excellent? Thank you.
Okay. Just going back about 2 minutes into your discourse here. When Laban treated his son-in-law so badly, deception all the time, always turning the whatever agreements were upside down, there's never been an apology or remorse shown by Laban.
Correct.
Okay, so I don't know if I'm going ahead or back, but later on, wasn't there something with some speckled calves, and he was changing the calves the way they were born and so forth? So to deceive Laban, maybe to get some revenge. Am I moving ahead or am I moving back?
You're going back. You're going back. So that's part of Jacob's grievance against Laban. But Laban does not take responsibility and does not apologize. Right. So the reading, the way the traditional view, the traditional view, the rabbinic view of Laban is that Laban is less than honest. But like most people who are less than honest, he tries to appear as an honest person. So he never takes responsibility. He doesn't say I was wrong. In fact, he basically tells Jacob, oh, let's make an oath that you don't harm my daughters. Why would we think that Jacob would harm his daughters? Jacob was very respectful to his daughters. In fact, Laban was disrespectful for his daughters by selling them for 7 years of labor. In other words, selling them, using them as his possession, and getting 7 years of labor for work for each of them. So, but that's the nature of someone who's dishonest. He will accuse the other person of exactly what he is. So he then says, if you hadn't known anything about the history of Laban, you would say, wow, what a beautiful father, protective father protecting his daughters. He wants his son-in-law to make an oath that he's not going to harm his daughters when they go back to Canaan, and the father-in-law is going back to Aram. So impressive, so beautiful to see. But of course, at least from our perspective, at least the rabbinic reading, Laban is dishonest, and he doesn't care about his daughters. It's just a way of just a posture of positioning himself in the conversation with Jacob and saying, I'm the moral one. I have to make sure you need to take an oath that you're not going to harm my daughters, right? So this is all part of the fraud. The big fraud is that the fraudster presents himself as being honest. And usually it's exactly what he is lacking in. He accuses the other person of lacking from, of suffering from. So yes, he's not honest and he doesn't take responsibility, and that's Laban for you.
Did they build each one build the stone thing? So Laban suggested that, right?
So let's see. Let's read this carefully. Jacob is the first one. In 44, on page 167 and 44, Laban says, let's make a covenant. And let's make a covenant and let's have a testimony. Jacob raises a stone, and Jacob also makes a pile of stones. So Jacob is doing both. After they do both, why do you need both? Then you have Laban names it and Jacob names it. And then Laban starts talking, interpreting what the pile of stones are. And then he talks about what the matzeva is, what the monument is. And then Laban once again in 51, Laban once again starts talking about this mound and this monument. So he says, which I placed between us. He never placed it. Jacob placed it.
See, he's already lying. And he keeps pointing,
and they keep talking. Why is he talking so much? So obviously there's something wrong. Obviously there's some tension here that they're not seeing everything in the same way. And so something is happening. Like I said, you read this quickly, it's like, okay, they're getting along, they're eating breakfast. And he said that, have a nice day. That's goodbye party, goodbye, let's go home. But the Torah is not just sitting and wasting your time. So all these verses are conveying something. They're conveying something. I'm not saying I know the answer to what they are, but I certainly have a suggestion, not my own, but collected. But the bottom line is, we have to get to build it up. We can't just jump in. Otherwise, I'm not going to finish my coffee. Go ahead, Vicky, please.
Thank you, Rabbi, for taking my question. I actually have a couple of questions. The first is about verse 53. May the God of Abraham and God of Nahor. So obviously, they know that there are at least two gods.
No, it could be the same. It could be it's the same. It could be the history of Nahor is like this. The way it could be it's the same God. In other words, it's just saying that just like you said, there's the God of Abraham and the dread of Isaac, the fear of Isaac, the God of Isaac. So you're saying he's basically saying it's the God of the family. So he's mentioning the both grandparents, which is both branches of the family, because Abraham and Nahor were brothers, and Abraham was Jacob's grandfather, and Nahor was Laban's grandfather, not great grandfather, right? Laban, the son of Bethuel, the grandfather. So Nahor is the grandfather of Laban. So these two people are basically saying, Laban says, it's the God of my grandfather, the God of your grandfather. That's innocent enough if you want.
Can you read it that it's two separate gods or two separate ideologies? Like because Abraham clearly was believing in one God and the rest of the family did not. That's my first question. And the second question is about the Laban. Did he have a wife? And she has a name, or she hasn't? Or we don't even know about her.
It's not in the scripture. Maybe there's a medrash that names her name. I don't know. But again, the fact that I don't know doesn't mean that.
It also speaks about his character, because his wife not even in the picture.
Right. Well, the scripture doesn't necessarily talk about the woman unless it's important to the plot. Like even we talk about Laban's, we talk about in the previous story, we talk about when Rebecca ran to her mother. I don't think it's named the mother, because the scripture is not necessarily going to tell you too much about the name, about the woman, unless it's critical to the story, I think.
But if it wasn't critical to him, that's not critical to the story, so it's not important.
I'm not disagreeing with you, but again, you have to see if that's out of character for other women in that era. So you would have to, if you want to be fair to him, we'd have to examine that question. But we'll get to the gods in a minute. The God of Abraham, God of Nahor. I have something to say about that. We'll get to that in a minute. But first, I want to say something else. I want to give two interpretations, but let me see if I can get it straight here, so I don't mislead you. Yeah? You agree, disagree, question?
No, I mean, Nahor was obviously an idolater.
At some point, but at some point, maybe maybe at some point he was influenced. I don't know. At least that's the way Laban is spinning the story. So you're saying, you're not buying the spin. Okay. The Medrash says like this. The Medrash says that Abraham was preaching about monotheism, the one God. And the king tried to kill him, and he was saved. The Medrash says he was thrown into the fiery pit, but other people say it means not literally, it means that and he was saved from the fiery pit. So the Medrash says, other people, a little bit more rationalists like the Barbanel says, well, it doesn't mean he was thrown into the fiery pit. It means it was decreed that he should be thrown into the fiery pit, and he was saved. He was able to escape. So Abraham himself.
Oh,
The Medrash then says that Abraham has a brother named Haran who died young in the lifetime of his father. The mother is actually the father of Sarah. So Abraham is married to his niece. Haran, it says he died on the face of Terach, his father. That's what the verse says in Noach. Right before the story, if you want to go back, you could see it. He died on the face of his father. The Medrash says that means he died because of Terach, his father. Remember, Terach was in the idol business, and he was a prominent member of the court of Nimrod, the king of the idolatrous king of the time. And it's a threat that his children are preaching monotheism, which is undermining the king. So he reports to the king that my sons are troublemakers. So Haran says, let me see what happens to Abraham. And if Abraham is saved, I will go with Abraham. If Abraham dies, I'll denounce him. So the Medrash says that's why Abraham was saved. But Haran, once Abraham was saved, Haran also said, oh, I believe like Abraham. And then Haran was killed. That's what the Medrash says. I want to see how much Rashi talks about this. That's what the Medrash says. Yeah, it's in Rashi as well. If you look back to the page 51, the verse reads as follows. Haran, verse 28, Haran died in the lifetime of Terach, his father, in his native land in Ur Kasdim. So Rashi says, quotes the Medrash, not in the life of his father, literally it says on the face of Terach, his father. So the conventional interpretation is in the life of Terach, his father. Rashi says it means because of Terach, his father, as I mentioned. What am I telling you? I'm just saying this to show that yes, it's not so simple. Nahor probably was an idol worshiper. Did he at some point do teshuvah? I don't know. So Steve says that Laban is basically saying, "Oh, we have the same God. We can all be friends. Your grandfather, my grandfather, we had the same God." Steve is saying, "Well, maybe it wasn't the same God. Maybe Nahor was not a believer in the one God, and maybe Laban is just spinning a tale here." Okay, makes sense. Makes sense.
I just have an interesting thought, and I can bring it to more contemporary times. Just because you sell idols doesn't mean that you believe in them.
Correct.
And the interesting thing is, if you ever visit the Vatican at St. Peter's Square, almost all the vendors are Jews.
Yeah.
So,
I think I heard that Bloomberg, his first business was selling Christmas trees. Michael Bloomberg. And then, in Boston, when he was a kid, when he was like 10 years old. But there's an old joke. The old joke is that in front of a terrible joke, but I'll say it anyway. Is in front of the church, and there's a Jew collecting money in front of the church. So there's a Gentile and a Jew, both paupers, both collecting money. And all the people see the Jew and they're anti-Semites, they hate the Jew. So to spite the Jew, they give money to the Gentile and they don't give money to the Jew and they curse out the Jew. This is happening a whole Sunday morning for 2 hours. Finally, somebody comes up to this guy, to the Jew, and says, "Look, you're in the wrong place. I don't know what you're doing here. You should go collect money in front of the synagogue. Why are you collecting money in front of the church?" So the Jew turns to his friend, the pauper, the Gentile, and says, "Yankel, look who's telling us how to make money." So I don't know how I said that. Oh, so yes, if you're selling idols,
Rabbi, no more jokes.
no more jokes.
That's good.
So the bottom, so the bottom line is, it doesn't mean if you're selling idols doesn't mean you believe in them, but if you're part of the system, right? You are invested in the kingdom, which is an idol worshiping kingdom, and monotheism, as we discussed when we discussed that on page 50, monotheism is a threat to kings, because the king, especially the king of Nimrod, we believe that was Nimrod. We believe that the king presents himself, at least in those days, the king presents himself as the idol, as the god, and he says he believes that there's supposed to be a hierarchy, and the king is on top of the hierarchy, even if there's a god above the king, but the king is on top of the hierarchy. And you talk about monotheism, is that there's one God, there's not many levels of rulers, there's only one God, and everybody stands equally before God. That's a terrible threat to the king, to any king. And that's why we said Abraham shows up to town, and all of a sudden there's a battle, 94 kings against 5 kings. The whole world order is turning upside down. Everybody's rebelling against kings. And many people believe it's because of the influence of Abraham, the first person saying there's no kings, there's no, we're all equal before Hashem. So my point is, if Terach was a prominent member of the society, then Abraham preaching monotheism, it's not just that he's undermining his business, but he's also undermining his position in the society. And that was dangerous. So that's why he's willing to give up his give over his children to the king, to straighten them out or to kill them.
Rabbi, my question was about one stone and many stones. Maybe that's what Jacob meant, that he believes in one God and his opponent did not.
Problem is that, Jacob also makes many stones. That's the problem.
No, well, he did make many stones, maybe just because it was a covenant with a person who believes in many.
Could be.
But he erects one stone for himself.
Okay, could be. Hey, give me just 1 second. I'm going to read this, the Malbim over here, and then I'm going to we'll give at least 2 interpretations to the story, and then we'll take more interpretations. Okay, are we ready to do this? Okay. The only question is if we should do it with this book, or that we put it on the screen. If anybody on the screen wants me to put the book verses on the screen, let me know. Otherwise, you'll trust me that what I'm reading is the truth. Okay. We're going to start with 2 verses here, with the naming of this covenant, and there's going to be a difference between what Jacob says and what Laban says. We're going to explain that difference according to the Malbim, and once we're done that, we'll give an overarching view, interpretation of the whole story. So a little different than the Malbim, but for now, you want to look at verses in the article, page 169. You want to look at verses 47 and 48. Laban called it Yagar Sa'aduta, which is Aramaic for, Jacob called it Gal Eid. The mound is a witness. Okay. Yagar Sa'aduta is the same thing in Aramaic. Then Laban says in 48, and Laban declared, this mount is a witness between me and you today. Therefore, he called its name Gal Eid. Now he's basically saying also the words Gal Eid.
Gal Eid Hebrew or Aramaic?
Gal Eid is Hebrew.
So he said it in Jacob's language.
He says it in Jacob's language, but there's a difference here. There's Getting a little confused.
What'd you say Gal means to you?
Gal is a mound.
A mound?
Mound.
Isn't it a wave?
Gal could be a wave, but not only. Yeah.
What's a wave?
Like on the beach.
Okay, I'm going to just make a little differentiation here. Yigar Saduta is not the same thing as Gal Eid. Yigar Saduta is the mountain of testimony. We're going to differentiate between testimony and witness. Yaakov Karalo, Yaakov referred to this as the mountain is a witness. Laban says the mountain is testimony. In addition to the fact that they speak different languages, they're also saying different things. Okay, the mountain is testimony versus the mountain is a witness. That's one clear difference. Laban referred to it as mountain as testimony. Yaakov refers to it as Galeed. So that's the opening that will give us one opening to one interpretation of what's happening here. So what exactly does each person want in this covenant? Two people come to make a covenant. Each person has an interest. What is their interest? What is the fear? Jacob doesn't want Laban to come harm him. That is something that's out in the open. If he breaks the covenant, everybody's going to know about it. There are witnesses that he's coming and is chasing Jacob, right? It's not a concealed matter. What Laban is quote unquote concerned about, or what he claims to be concerned about, is something in secret, which is what? Which is that Jacob may harm his daughters, Jacob's wives, his daughters. If that happens, nobody knows about it. Only God knows about it, right? If you look at the verses, for example, look at 49. So 49, he says, and for this matzeva, this is still Laban speaking, for this mitzvah, because he said, may Hashem keep watch between me and you when we are out of each other's sight. Kinisater, will be concealed man from his fellow. And he continues, if you will ill-treat my daughters, or if you will marry wives in addition to my daughters, though no man may be among us, but see, God is the witness between me and you. These are the words of Laban. Laban is basically saying, nobody's going to be here to testify, right? How you treat my daughters and you're in the privacy of your home, nobody knows. So God is going to be the witness. So, yeah, he has the idols. He came to chase them for the idols.
So now
right?
he's talking about God.
He's talking about God. He's talking about, look, you swear for your God. But what does he want? He basically is saying, I want that you should not harm my daughters. That's what he says. And he emphasizes we're going to be concealed one man from another. Ein ishimanu, nobody else is here. It's basically the only person that will know is God. And therefore, make the covenant, God will be the witness. Okay. So that is what Laban wants. What Jacob wants, Jacob simply wants, don't run after me, and don't chase me. But if he would do so, in other words, like this, if Jacob breaks the deal, nobody knows about it, only God knows about it. If Laban breaks the deal, it's going to hit the news. Everyone's going to know about it. Everyone knows if Laban comes to chase Jacob. Right? So far, so good. So far, so good. Okay. Says the Malbim. That's the difference between testimony and witness. Witness is an act, the person giving witness. So Jacob says this mountain will be a witness, referring to the act of testimony. People could be the witness. This mountain represents that people are the witness. When you say testimony is much more abstract than witness. We're not referring to a person. We're referring to the concept. And therefore he says, Laban says, what I need is Yigar Sahaduta. What I need is God to be the witness. And therefore he doesn't refer to it as witness, because there is no witness. God is the witness. So by this reading in verse 47, each one names what he wants of the other person. Laban says, I want testimony, meaning I want testimony is an abstract concept. I want God to be the witness. Laban refers to it as Gal Eid, the mountain should be the witness. And the mountain, by the way, is many stones. What's many stones? Representing many people. Many people are going to testify. Now let's go back let's go back a second. Look, 45 and 46. Jacob took a stone and raised it up as a monument. When you read these words, what's a monument? A monument is a way of serving God. That's what it was in the olden days. How do I know that? Jacob himself. Look at the beginning of this parsha. This parsha is an interesting parsha because it begins and ends in the same way. It begins and ends with angels, with dreams, and with the monument. So if you look at the beginning of this parsha, after Jacob wakes up from his famous dream where he sees the ladder, he says on page 147, Jacob wakes up in the morning, verse 18. Jacob arose early in the morning and took the stone that he placed around his head and set it up as a pillar. They translate pillar, but it's the same thing, matzeva, same word. And he poured oil on its top, and he named the place Bethel. However, Luz was the city's name originally. Then Jacob took a vow, saying, if God will be with me, will guard me on this way that I am going, will give me bread to eat and clothes to wear, and I return in peace to my father's house, and Hashem will be a God to me, then this stone which I have set up as a pillar shall become a house of God, and whatever you shall give me, I shall repeatedly tithe to you. Beginning of the parsha, he's about to leave the land of Israel to go to the Haran for 20 years. He takes a stone, makes a pillar, says, this is a matzeba, this is a pillar, this is how I serve God. That's the symbol of service of God, one stone. So here at the end of the parsha, where Laban says, let's make a covenant, he makes a matzeba, a pillar, one stone. This is clearly a pillar to God. Then in verse 46, he tells his brethren, who's his brethren? It's not clear. Either his sons, Rashi says his sons, some people say that people who were with Laban, but his brethren, he says, gather stones and they make a mound and they eat lunch there, they eat breakfast there. So the Malbim says that's what there's two things here. Jacob needs God. In other words, to satisfy Laban, we have to bring God into the picture. That's matzeva. To satisfy what Jacob needs, you need witnesses, you need people. And therefore he makes a mound which was built by many people, which represents many people going to come and testify to this. Maybe also Jacob I'm adding, maybe Jacob doesn't think that Laban is afraid of God, but maybe he's afraid of people. So that's why they have these two. That's why they have these two separate signs, and that's why they name it differently, because they each have a different interest. That's the Malbim. That's in the 19th century. This is just one way of looking at it. Once you read it this way, and you see the subtlety, we'll get to more contemporary interpretations, which in my view are a little bit more interesting, but we have to start with the traditional. And you see here that people are saying there is a problem. They're doing two signs, naming it different names. There must be a reason for this dance. And the first interpretation was because they each have a different interest. And they have a different interest, so they have to do this. So there's different protections. The quote-unquote protection that Laban gets against Jacob is bringing God into the picture. What Jacob needs against Laban is just something that's in the open. So we just need people to testify. And that's the mountain that people create. And it's also aid. Aid is a witness. It's an active testimony. Verse Yigar Sahadutab, besides being in Aramaic, is also an abstract concept. Testimony as opposed to witness. So that's the Malbim.
So they agreed on testimony and they agreed on witness.
They didn't really agree. Jacob says witness, because that's what Jacob wants. And Laban says testimony, because that's what he wants.
So this is doomed to failure from the beginning.
This is doomed to failure. Okay, but you could say it depends what a treaty is. If we both make a treaty, we have different interests. We make a contract. Each one protects their own interests, and they live happily ever after. That could be one way to read it. So each person here is if they can't agree on what the sign is, there's two signs and there's two names. But maybe it's good because each person is getting what they need in this deal. That's what the Malbim says. Again, I have no choice. I have to take it until you give me a better interpretation of what this dance is. Now, I'll give you more of a contemporary interpretation. It's not disagreeing with anything I said, but it's just giving the bigger picture. It is not saying, it's adding to it. It's sort of a bigger picture, and this is the big idea. The big idea is like this. Laban wants a covenant. What does a covenant mean? Laban is the first one who says, let's make a covenant. What does a covenant mean in that culture? What does a covenant mean earlier in the Bible up to this point? What promise for what? What type of promise? What does the promise entail? What does it look like? So we know Abraham made a covenant with multiple people, but with the king of Plishtim later. But even before, it talks about Aner Eshkol and Mamre. When he lived in Hebron, he had a covenant with 3 tribes in the area who supported him, and at some point they were Baalei Brit, they were members of his covenant, of his alliance. And Isaac also makes the covenant with the king of Pichol when he wants to live in a certain area. So the contemporary commentators say like this: if you're living in a tribal society, you need a covenant, right? You're just one person, you need a covenant, they'll protect you. And protection is they protect you, but you're sort of part of their covenant. And that's what Laban is saying. Laban is saying, let's make a covenant. Let's establish, you're going home, you're part of my clan. Nobody will stand up with you because they're afraid of me. That's the way it is in a tribal society. This is all Laban's agenda. What's Laban's agenda? What he keeps saying. The daughters are my daughters. The sons are my sons. We read that earlier today. When he tells Laban, what do you think? I'm going to harm you. The daughters are my daughters, the sons are my sons. Sounds like he's being a gracious grandfather and a gracious father-in-law, but he's not. What he is saying is he's asserting his authority, right? That's the cleverness of Laban. He's speaking and making believe like, oh, I'm so kind to you. Of course, I would never harm you. These are my children. They're not your children. They were your children, but you gave them up, right? So, but Laban's agenda is to expand his own. Laban's agenda is to expand that Jacob is and Jacob's children and wealth are part of his tribe. That's Laban's agenda. When Laban says, let's make a covenant, that's what it looks like. Now, how we see it in the verses will give me a minute. But when Jacob is making a covenant, it's a different covenant altogether. His covenant is we're separating, we're not going to harm each other. That's not the same covenant. And that's why each one is talking, because each one is saying something else, because they're not on the same page. Ultimately, Laban agrees with Jacob because there's no one to talk to. So we end up with that covenant that it's not that that Laban is part of, that Jacob is part of Laban's clan. Rather, they are separate. Where is this the most clear in the verses? The most clear. The most clear is with the gods. Laban says, let's make an oath with the gods of Abraham and the gods of Nahor. Beautiful. We're all one family. What does Jacob say? I would expect him to say, he took an oath with the God of his father Abraham. He doesn't mention Abraham. Why not? Because Laban mentioned Abraham. Instead, what does it say? Jacob took an oath with the dread, the fear of his father Isaac. He didn't mention Abraham. You see what's happening here? Whatever Laban says, Jacob says something else. Because the point here is they're severing ties. He's saying, I'm not part of your covenant, I'm my own covenant. It's so clear when you read those verses. So look at the page 169, right? The verse reads, verse 53 and 54. You can't get any more clear. May the God of Abraham and the God of Nahor judge between us, the God of their father. All one family. You have Abraham, you have Nahor, and their father, whoever his name was, whatever their name was, Terach. Terach was their father. Terach was certainly an idol worshiper. But basically what he's trying to say is we're all one clan. You remember my grandfather, your grandfather, we ate breakfast together. We went to the same Hanukkah parties. What does Jacob say? And Jacob swore by the dread of his father Isaac. Doesn't mention Abraham. Because Nahor includes Abraham into their camp because they grew up together. Isaac didn't grow up with them. They don't know Isaac. They never saw Isaac. Isaac never left Israel. Right? So there's clearly a distinct, there's clearly no connection between Laban and Isaac, and that's specifically why Jacob mentions Isaac and does not mention does not mention his grandfather Abraham, because for Jacob this is severing of ties. This is not a separation. This is not a connection. Now that is why if you want to read this again, you want to go back to verse 44, for example. So Jacob says, let's make a covenant. Laban says, let's make a covenant. What does Jacob do? Jacob picks up a single stone. What does a single stone mean? We already read in the beginning of the parsha, single stone represents his alliance to the one God. So what's Jacob highlighting? Jacob is highlighting, I'm not in your clan. I'm not part of you. I have my own culture. I have my own philosophy. I'm my own person. I serve the one God. So his response, when Jacob says, when Laban says, let's make a covenant, me and you will be a witness between me and you, in verse 44, For 55 seems like Jacob is agreeing with Laban. It's not agreeing with Laban, it's a rejection of Laban. 55 reads, then Jacob took a stone and raised it up as a monument. What is he saying? Does he agree with Laban? No, I'm not making a covenant with you in your definition of a covenant, which means you're offering your protection above me. I'm an extension of your clan. No, I have my own way of life. I have the one God which I serve, and the one stone is a metaphor for that, as we saw at the beginning of the parsha. However, Jacob does say, I am willing to do something else. And that's why it's not that late. That's why we asked, one of the questions we asked is, why does Jacob do two things? He raises a single stone and makes a mound makes a pile of stones. Which one is it? So he says, the first one, he says, I'm not part of your definition of a covenant. I have one stone, that's the one God, but here's what I am willing to do. I'm willing to do something completely different, which is make a pile of stones, which represents a border, which represents that we're equals, multiple stones, we're equals. I'm not part of you, you're a stone, I'm a stone. Each person brings a stone, we're equals, but it's a border that will separate us in peace. That I'm willing to do. And that's what happens in verse 46. In verse 46, Jacob said to his brethren, meaning Laban's people, gather stones. So they took stones, they made a mound, and they ate there on the mound. Laban called it Yagar Sahaduta, Jacob called it Galeed. Again, he's calling it something different.
Jacob was afraid of Laban, that's why he made this agreement. Why didn't he just, I don't remember, why didn't he just leave?
He left, he ran away. But now
Why didn't he just?
they have to part. So what are we parting? Are we parting as friends? Or are we parting as enemies?
Does it matter?
It matters. You have to have closure. If I have a relationship with you and living with you for 20 years, and I pick up and leave, and then you chase me, you say, why are you leaving? What's going on here? Are we on good terms? Are we on bad terms? It's very logical. We want to establish our terms. What's the terms of our relationship? Do we hate each other? Are we going to fight each other? Are you going to come attack me at night? Am I going to attack you at night? What is the nature of our relationship? So so Laban says, let's make a covenant. You're part of my clan. I'll protect you. You'll be loyal to me. I own all your possessions. Laban says, Jacob is so when you read it this way, it looks like they're making peace here, but almost everything Laban says, Jacob does something different.
That's why he should have left.
He left.
Felt like
He left, but that's the point. The point is, I'm not signing the agreement on your terms. And at the end, you leave with the separation. Jacob wakes up and they kiss each other and they bless each other, and Laban goes home and Jacob goes home. Fine, that's the separation. And some people say that's indeed the final separation. When Abraham's family leave Aram Naharaim and end up in Israel, they're never going back there again. They're not going back to marry more children, right? The tribes marry either their siblings or Canaanite girls, which is another story, depending who you ask. But they're not going back to Nahor. So when you read this way, it's actually interesting that the terms change. Verse 55, verse 51 is interesting. Laban said to Jacob, here is this mound and here is the monument which I have cast between me and you. Have you ever heard such a greater lie? Who put the monument? Jacob put the monument. Now Laban is saying, I cast it. In other words, Laban is trying to reinterpret what Jacob did. Ultimately, this mound shall be witness, and the monument shall be witness that I may not cross over to you past this mound, nor may you cross over to me past this mound and this monument for evil. In other words, he agrees to Jacob's terms. The second suggestion that Laban says, okay, now I'm going to use this mound as a sign. The second suggestion is far more ambitious. It's not a covenant. What it is it's a treaty that I'm not going to harm you and you're not going to harm me. So the second try is much less ambitious. But even when he's less ambitious, he's still trying to include himself in the family. And therefore 53 says, may the God of Abraham, the God of Nahor, judge between us, the God of their father. Jacob swore by the dread of his father Isaac. So even once Laban steps down, he says, okay, it's not a conventional covenant. You're not part of my clan, but let's make a covenant that we're not going to harm each other. And remember, even before that, there's one more subtlety. In 50, sorry, I'm jumping all around the board, but 50, he says, part of the covenant is, if you will ill-treat my daughters, or if you will marry wives in addition to my daughters, though no man may be among us, but see, God is a witness between me and you. And Laban said to Jacob, I don't see a response from Jacob. If I'm Jacob, I'm not responding. Why? What's offensive in that verse? My daughters. They're not your daughters. They're my wives. You see, so Laban is pushing his agenda. Let's make a covenant. You're part of my clan. These are my daughters, right? And slowly but surely, because Jacob is not participating, Laban is climbing down the tree. And ultimately agreeing to less than a covenant. It's just a sign that we're not going to harm each other. And Jacob is basically not going along with him. He's not making a covenant by his father Abraham and Nachor. And it's more of a parting of the ways as opposed to cementing the connection between the two. So that is one way of reading this. I thought that was interesting because it explains some of the back and forth of the conversation.
Do we
And
know
of
what
the
happened after all of this? Did anybody go after anybody?
after the Medrash says that generations later, there's an interesting Medrash. Generations later, when the Jewish people are about to enter Israel, the king of Moab hires Bilam from Aramean, to come curse the Jews. The Medrash says that Bilam is a descendant of Laban, and he's coming to curse the Jews. And the Medrash says that in the story, it's a very strange story, but in the story, the donkey, if you remember the story with the talking donkey, one of the things the donkey does is it scratches Laban's foot against the wall of stones. That's one obstacle. And it makes a whole deal. Why did you do that? The Medrash says that wall was the mount. He's telling him, why are you passing to do harm? You're not, he ends up blessing him, but that's what the Medrash says. So, but the point of the story is that now there's separation. That there has to be a cut between. You have to start. It has to be a cut between Jacob's family and the idol worshippers of Laban's family. There has to be a cut. They're our family. They were our family. We go back to marry them, but at some point we're starting our own story, and starting our own story is cutting with the past, and that's what they're doing right here. And it's funny because it takes time, and that's why, again, if you just read it quickly, it just looks like it's just a drawn out story. But if you read it carefully, you realize that it's not a drawn out story. Laban suggests Jacob does not go along, et cetera, et cetera. They climb down the tree. They end up with a much more limited version of the covenant. I'm not going to harm you. You're not going to harm me. And they live happily ever after. They go home. Verse 1, and Laban awoke early in the morning. He kissed his sons and daughters and blessed them. Then Laban went and returned to his place. Jacob went on his way. The angels of God encountered him. We'll talk about that next week. And they separate and live happily ever after. But that tension in the beginning, where Laban says they're my daughters, and he keeps saying, refers to them as my daughters. And Jacob is basically saying, I have to run away from you because I'm afraid you're going to steal your daughters, and they're not your daughters, they're my wives. So that tension is alive and well in the subtlety of these verses. So that's the story in short. I hope this was interesting. That brings us to the end of the saga of Laban and Jacob. We spent about 4 weeks on this. And the next week we talk about Jacob now turning back and going back home. And eventually he's going to have to meet his brother Esav, as we mentioned last week. Now he's prepared for the confrontation because thanks to Rachel, who stole her father's gods. So her father had chased Jacob. Jacob had to confront his father-in-law, survive that confrontation, and now he could confront his brother. So that's the story in short. Thank you all for joining.
Yes, go, Rabbi.
Do you think Laban
Thank you.
Jacob's money to
I think he was after the family, the money, the wealth. Yes. If you see, you know, even today, if you're a big company and you see a successful company, well, first thing you want to do is buy them out, right? In other words, I'm happy for your success, but I want to be in charge.
this was
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank
Okay,
you, Lillian.
sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's very involved.
I still don't understand why Jacob wasted his time with Laban. I mean, he didn't, I don't know that he trusted him anyway. Why didn't he?
Bye-bye, Rabbi.
Hey, Kenny, have a good day.
Why didn't he just leave?
Why didn't he just leave? He tried to leave, and then someone confronts you. What are you going to do? Ignore the guy. You have to speak to them, and you have to assert your position
I guess.
and agree to what you agree with, and disagree with what you don't agree with. Go ahead, Bob, please.
Thank you, Rabbi. Terrific class, and I just want to make a few comments. I think if you ever found the first opportunity for the words trust and verify, here we are. Because in the beginning, why would anybody sit down to a meeting with such a scoundrel? I mean, he's clearly one of the biggest scoundrels, but he's a brilliant scoundrel. And I was going to bring up before you did Bilam and Balak, I mean, echoes of what was going to happen in the future. And I think the story here tells us that you have to deal with your enemies,
Right.
and you verify and enforce your agreements on their level. So
Right.
Laban came to him and said, God will be our witness. And Yaakov went to Laban and said, your people will be your witness.
Right.
And that's how they verified.
Right. So if you're making a treaty with somebody and you want to make peace, read the fine print. Don't necessarily, just because I want peace with you doesn't mean, not you, just because I want peace with the person doesn't mean I want peace on their terms. Right. So you're right. Jacob highlights what he's willing to do, what he's not willing to do. First of all, he understands, he knows the parameters of this agreement from his perspective. And eventually Laban comes along. But it's not like, oh, I want to be nice to you, so I'm just going to agree with everything you say. No, you want a covenant. Okay, but it's my covenant on my terms. And like you say, let's not bring in God from Laban's perspective. In other words, Laban brings in God for Jacob, but Jacob basically says, we need people to testify this because I don't trust that you are a God-fearing man, but you're certainly afraid of people. And we need a sign, which would be the stones that people build. So people are aware of this. Yes, I agree. Yeah, this is.
And similarly, Laban says to Yaakov, God will be your witness here, because he knows that he is a more pious man, and that
Correct.
to verify that he turns to God. Brilliant guy.
Correct. And if you look at the language of the agreement, how he defines God, he's trying to include Abraham, Nahor, their father. We have a grandfather. And Jacob, even in the midst of assuming the friendship and asserting the friendship, he still asserts his own distinctiveness. He mentions the dread of my father Isaac. They have no idea Isaac. They never saw a picture of him. They never saw him, right? So Isaac is clearly a separation and a separation from their family, and he's very careful not to agree to give any credence to the notion that he's part of Laban's clan.
Brilliant jurisprudence. Brilliant.
He's also careful. Yes, indeed. Okay, wonderful day, everybody. We'll pick up next week, God willing, in good health.
Have a good week,
Thank you.
everyone.
Take care,
Thank you,
Steve.
Rabbi. That was
Thank